Thank you, Gemma. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's talk. You see, it's got the lovely title, Remember, Remember. We're all familiar with sort of that attempted bonfire night, that attempted plot with Guy Fawkes one, but Gloucestershire has been involved in lots of other plots, rebellions, conspiracies. So, as I said here, so before you raise a toast to the wee gentleman in the velvet jacket, order a barrel of gunpowder, you better check you've signed the latest oath of allegiance and that your 51 with the 13 is secure, lest you be accused in a 63 to overthrow 50. Although I've given them the answers there, that'll become apparent. Well, that's all about a little bit later. So we'll start off very quickly. First one, we've got reference from the archives here is Holland's Rising in 1400. I'd never heard of it. I expect none of you have either. Also known as the Epiphany Rising. It was a failed rebellion against Henry IV in January 1400. It basically took place when several barons, there was a whole long list, the Earl of Salisbury, Huntingdon, Duke of Exeter, he was the half-brother of Richard II, the Earl of Kent, first Baron Lumley, and the Baron Despenser. They all basically tried to restore Richard II to the throne. And we've got an account of it written sort of a couple of hundred years later by the assistant curate of Cirencester, a chap called Joseph Kilner. The plotters had hoped to seize the king during a tournament, kill him, and restore Richard II, but it failed as the king was warned what was going to happen. And you think, well, where's the Gloucestershire connection? Well, quite simply, most of those conspirators fled to the West Country, hoping to sort of raise the population, but they found little support, and they were basically defeated in the short, slightly violent battle with the townsfolk of Cirencester, when several of the ringleaders were actually captured and then sent to the town to be a tower to be executed, etc., as you usually did back then. The second one we've got a nice word off is the Pilgrimage of Grace from 1537. Also known as the Northern Rebellion, this was a popular revolt beginning in Yorkshire in 1536, which led to other parts of northern England, and it expanded as the year went by. Come on, there we go. Gloucestershire was involved due to the King's orders. It was all about the biggest of the Tudor rebellions at the time. My machine's just messed up there. It's given us several clicks instead of one. But it was all about the grievances that the people had, especially the northern parts had, about the King's break with the Catholic Church. Gloucestershire involved primarily because of the King's orders to muster men to serve as troops against rebellion. And we've got an entry in our Red Book of Gloucester, which is one of the earliest borough records we have. In 1537 records when men were sent to serve in the King's forces. As you can see there, it's very difficult to read, quite scrappy writing really, but it does there from the left hand side says the names of the soldiers sent to Amphill when the insurrection was in the North Country. So there's lots of little things like this, and there are a couple of other entries recording troops being sent north to help deal with it. So, Rising of the North, this was also called the Revolt of the North or the Northern Rebellion. It was again a failed attempt by the Northern Catholic nobles to depose Queen Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. Come on, machine. There we go. Unable to win support, the rebellion crumbled when Elizabeth's army of about 10,000 men headed north, and the rebels that were caught were severely punished. Over 800 were executed, and there were severe reprisals exacted on the area, especially in Yorkshire, around that area there. And it was notorious for sort of having these problems and these just sort of this crackdown, even for many years later. Again, Gloucester Borough accounts, the Chamberlain's accounts this time include numerous references to musters of men and provision of monies to fund soldiers and their equipment. And this is a typical entry here. It's very confused, but it starts halfway on the second line where the actual sort of dark you can just make out ITE start, which is item, and then it goes on to say also in money paid for frieze to make coats for the soldiers which were appointed to go into the north. More than was gathered for the liberties of the city. So basically saying we've gathered troops, some to protect the city, but a lot are going north. And frieze was a woolen fabric with a long uncapped nap, so it would have been looked almost quite shaggy in appearance, I would think. So it must have been quite warm because it would trap the air. So that's what you want if you're going up north from down here. You need something to keep you warm. The Irish Rebellion, 1598, known as the 9 Years' War. This was fought in response to the ongoing Tudor conquest of Ireland by an Irish alliance. led generally by the O'Neills of Tyrone and the O'Donnells of Tyrconnell. That's a bit of a tongue twister. As with previous rebellions, the county's involvement was primarily supplying men to serve in the army. And this is a nice extract. This is an order to the High Constable to muster 36 soldiers at Stroud and levy £54 6 for the war in Ireland. The rebellion ended in English victory, but through a mix of military actions, a scorched earth policy that was employed, and also negotiation. And the latter was helped because this was the first sort of war that the new King James I faced, and basically he wanted it to come to a halt. The main reason was because it had virtually bankrupted the exchequer, so he needed it to stop because he couldn't afford it anymore. And from that, we have this letter to the Privy Council from the 4th Baron Chandos of Sudeley. He wrote this letter to the Privy Council saying he'd levied and impressed out of this county of Gloucester for Her Majesty's present service into a realm of Ireland the number of 100 sufficient and able men, and them has then sent them towards the port of Bristol under the conduct of John Lewes, master of this county. He also notes that he'd sent up £350 to be paid into Her Majesty's exchequer, and also provided a list of the names, surnames and dwelling place of the said soldiers. Sadly, that bit hasn't survived, and I've not found it yet. Whether it's become separated, we don't know. But I do like also, if you look at the bottom left-hand side of that thing, there's another paragraph, and this is a rather a tactful suggestion that he be paid according to Her Majesty's usual allowance for coat and conduct, which comes to, for 100 minutes at 3 days, the coat £20, for 3 days march at £8 per diem, £10. So he'd sent this money out, but he wanted 30 quid back because that's what he paid for the men's uniforms and things. So again, that's a case of giveth with one hand and taketh with the other, I think. Moving on to the English Civil War, essentially. So Gloucestershire, it's played a very important part in the Civil War, most notably the Siege of Gloucester, which is coming up to the anniversary soon. That marked the turning point in the First Civil War, it's arguably said, because the king never really recovered from it. And also then the Battle of Stow on the Road, 1646, which effectively ended the First Civil War. But we know Puritan influence is strong in the county, especially in Gloucester and Stroud. Things came to a head for the start of the war, really, when Charles I began demands for ship money from the England counties. Ship money was usually paid by coastal counties to help fund ships for the navy, but Charles tried to extend it into the inland counties, and they were having none of it, really. And we have this lovely note again from the Borough Records. So in December 1639, Gloucester received a letter from the county's High Sheriff, who was Sir Humphrey Tracy, demanding payment of ship money on behalf of the king. And after it had been read in the council chamber, the Gloucester's mayor, the city sheriff, and some of the aldermen arranged to go and meet Tracy in Cheltenham on Christmas Eve. And here's the transcription of that. At this house, the letter of Mr. High Sheriff touching the ship money whereby Mr. Mayor was designed to meet the said High Sheriff at Cheltenham on Christmas Eve was read, and Mr. Singleton, Mr. Purey, one of the sheriffs, and 2 stewards were appointed to attend Mr. Mayor thither with their attendants. And if you know a little bit about this period, you know Mr. Singleton and Mr. Purey were sort of top people in Gloucester Borough at the time, and they made themselves very important during the siege. So the parliamentary supporters at this time were deemed rebels by the Crown, and that did change as time went by. And in early 1643, Gloucester, which was a known rebel stronghold, as said, Gloucester realised it was quite vulnerable, and at the time there was a royalist Welsh army under Lord Herbert approaching from the forest. He engaged in quite a sort of small or medium-sized skirmish at Colford, where the actual army's commander was killed. But it marched on, and on the 6th of March, the city council ordered that preparations were to be begun to make the city ready for war and for it to stand a siege. And this is one of the entries in the city books again. Whereas the city is threatened with a siege, and therefore it is requisite that the provisions of victuals be forthwith made for the youth inhabitants and soldiers. It is therefore agreed that Mr. Alderman Singleton, Mr. Woodward, Mr. Lane, Mr. Tither, John Edwards, and Mr. Roberts shall be employed as commissaries to contract any person or persons for things that may prove from victuals, or to take and receive any fat cattle, corn, or other provision. So this is they're basically getting ready. This is March, and we know that in the event the Welsh were defeated at the Battle of Hynham in a joint action by the city's commander, Lieutenant Edward Massey, and Sir William well as our parliamentary army, but the city realised it was in quite a dangerous position, especially after the fall of Bristol, when Gloucester was literally on its own. So in the event, the siege didn't occur until August, when the Royalist army of 6,000 infantry and a couple of thousand mounted troops began assembling around the city from various directions. King Charles set up his HQ at Matson House, but his demand for surrender was unanimously rejected in quite a rude way at the time, apparently. He decided not to launch a full-scale assault because he was wary of inflicting heavy casualties on the population. This is what had happened at Bristol when Prince Rupert had assaulted the city. There were really scary casualties, and Charles didn't want this repeated because he basically thought he's killing his own citizens, basically. We know that inside Gloucester at the time there are sort of about just under 5,000 civilians and about 1,500 troops. And although the city's sort of preparations for a siege had gone well and there was ample food, they were short of gunpowder when fighting began, so they had to be a bit wary of that. And this is, as I say, a lovely contemporary map showing the city defences at the time. Again, it was recently purchased for us by Friends of Gloucestershire Archives organisation. It was found in a book known as the Bibliotheca Gloucestrensis. We've got loads of copies of that. This book was found with this contemporary map in, and it's a fantastic archive for us to have. We know after the city, 6 days it took, the city was still holding out. On 5th of September, the Royalist forces were about to breach the city's east gate. They'd been mined and countermined it, and the defenders really were down to the last few barrels of gunpowder when the parliamentary army under the Earl of Essex arrived, signalling its arrival by firing cannon at the hills. And so basically Charles realised if he was caught away from Oxford, his war would be over. So he lifted the siege and the Royalist army dispersed, and the rebels had won. And it's probably a reason why the Royals don't like Gloucester ever since, I would imagine. That's the way I think about it anyway. In the Civil War, both sides employed propaganda, often in the form of what they call broadsheets. And these are basically one-sided sheets full of woodcut images and headlines. But there were some also more in-depth publications, newsletters, and other small newspapers were produced. This is a copy of the Parliamentary News Sheet, a perfect diurnal. This is as reports news from Colonel Massey in 1644, and these became really popular during the Civil War, not just because of the information they contained, but because whether they actually influenced people isn't long. But we know that they were soft, strong, and thoroughly absorbent, so they had another really important use in your life. Lots of people by this time could read little bits, so this is why they became so popular, and they grew in the broadsheets. Grew in popularity as the time went on. As with any sort of rebellion, civil war, internal conflict, it's often the innocent that suffered. And this is an entry in the Arlington burial register for 1643 and records the burial of Roger Williamson on 7th September. He was a servant of William Fowler of Saul, and he had been slain in a skirmish between some of the soldiers of the king and others of the Parliament in this parish. So that looks like a classic being in the wrong place at the wrong time, as you have these two opposing forces start clashing. And sadly, this bystander presumably was killed. We don't know whether he was involved in it at all. We don't think so, but a very sad bit of news there for him. So also we're very happy that we've got the Barwick ciphers. So throughout the Civil War, John Barwick, who's a doctor of divinity and chaplain to the Bishop of Durham, and his brother Peter Barwick were the principal and most trusted secret agents for Charles I. And from Durham House in London, John, aided by his brothers and a couple of other brothers as well actually, they sent a stream of coded letters about events in the capital to the king at Oxford. And they continued spying for the Royalists after the King's execution, and they communicated then with Charles II in exile. It's quite amazing. They could actually send letters to Oxford from London at the time and also send them abroad. But, however, in 1650, John was betrayed by a post office official to Parliament, and he basically had to destroy all the ciphers when the new model army troops were actually breaking the house door down to come into arresting in his house. So a fascinating little event. He was subsequently arrested and charged with high treason and sent to the Tower of London, but subsequently released 2 years later with no charge, essentially. So they decided it wasn't worth pursuing. He was later appointed Dean of St Paul's, while his brother Peter became physician to Charles II. So the family did quite well out of this in the end. So the link to Gloucestershire is due to the marriage of Sir Ralph Dutton, who's the first Baronet of Sherborne, to Mary Barwick. She was the sole surviving daughter and heir of Peter Barwick, and this marriage brought the Barwick papers, including a copy of one of their ciphers, into the county. So that's how we've got hold of it. And the letters to and from the king had to be sent in secret, obviously, and the brothers used a cipher that at the time was one of several royalist ciphers, and they did change a little bit through these. And this is the picture of one of the ones we have. It's quite fascinating to read. It's a very simple substitution cipher where numbers were used to represent whole words or part words. So in this one, you can just see at the very top there, the word king is substituted by the number 13, queen as 19, Cromwell 49, and parliament 50. And there are lots of other words there, and you can sort of roughly make up a reasonable letter used in this sort of thing. So if you remember from the first slide, I've put that your 51 with a 13 is secure, lest you be accused of being involved in a 63 to overthrow 50. If you translate that with the ciphers, it means that your correspondence with the king is secure, lest you be accused of being involved in a cabal to overthrow Parliament. So you could get a fair bit of information out of these. There are lots of other royalist ciphers, and if you're interested in these, there are some good sites on the internet where you can actually look at them as well. Of course, Charles I was executed. He basically, after defeat at Naseby, fled north to the Scots, thinking they'd look after him. But actually, they handed him over to Parliament, although only after Parliament had a payment of £100,000. And then Parliament began negotiations with Charles, who refused to accept a constitutional monarchy, and secretly he made a new alliance with Scotland. The new model army by this time lost patience with all his delaying tactics and launched a military coup, essentially taking control of the country. Subsequently, we know the Parliament indicted Charles for treason, and he was tried, found guilty, sentenced to death by beheading, which was carried out on 30th of January 1649. And the Vicar of Cirencester recorded this incident. And a little side note in the parish register: "O England, what did thou do the 30th of this month?" So this is really the only actual references you've got in the parish registers to the king's execution. Quick look at the Diggers. These were a group of agrarian socialists who flourished from 1649 to 50. Didn't quite get into the actual rebellion side of things, but they were close to it. They held the belief that the civil wars had been fought against the king and the great landowners, so their lands and common law land should be made available for the very poor to cultivate. And the number of diggers more than doubled during 1649. Their activities actually alarmed the Commonwealth government, and it roused the hostility of numerous local landowners who were rival claimants to the common lands. Diggers were harassed by legal actions and mob violence, where basically it's rent-a-mob time sort of thing like we've seen recently. And by April 1650, their first colony and most of their others have been dispersed. Now, the reason I mention them is there is one colony in Gloucestershire, but very little is known about this colony. However, if you come to our event next Saturday, which I'll give you the details at the end, you will find out more, because one of the talks is about the diggers in Gloucestershire, so it should be really interesting. Gunpowder treason, I'm sure we all know the line. Remember the 5th of November, gunpowder treason and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Gunpowder plots, failed attempt to assassinate King James I of England during the opening of Parliament in November 1605. The plan, as we know, organised by a devout English Catholic called Robert Catesby, who hoped to kill the Protestant King James and replace him with his daughter Princess Elizabeth, and thereby establish Catholic rule in England. Interestingly, his plan sort of worked, for Elizabeth's grandson later became George I, so it did work, although of course George I wasn't Catholic. We know there are 13 plotters in total, and among them is the classic Guy Fawkes, and you can see him in this famous woodcut here, just to right of centre. Guido Fawkes was his sort of other pseudonym name. So after the plot failed, the conspirators were all caught and killed, and after a trial, survivors were sentenced to death by hanging, drawing and quartering. And a nicety here was that prior to drawing, they were castrated first, so, just to make the pain go on a little bit longer. Um, but in January 1606, Parliament passed the Observance of 5th of November Act, and it made public thanksgiving for the gunpowder plot's failure an annual feature of English life. Church ministers had to hold a special service, reading the text and approved sermon on the day itself, on the 5th of November. And of course, then is where we get this sort of the bonfire night coming along, and the Presbyterian Church Warden's accounts 1684 record 14 shillings, about 83 quid, being spent on the bell ringers. That's probably just to pay for their booze, know what bell ringers are like, and also on wood faggots for a bonfire to commemorate the Papists' horrid powder plot, which you can see in that first paragraph. I love those words. Fawkes' legacy, it's very complicated. Obviously, even today, some rejoice his attempted actions, others celebrate his capture defeat. Gunpowder Treason Day has been with us ever since, accompanied by festivities where the bad guys, the Pope and Guy Fawkes, were burnt on bonfires and let fireworks off. 400 years later, we're still celebrating it. This is a picture from the Citizen, from the archive. It shows the Gloucester Park fireworks in 1992, over 30 years ago now, scarily. Today, your refugees, more usually politicians. Trump, Putin and Thatcher are still very, very popular, and no doubt they'll go on for a little while yet. Moving on to the Monmouth Rebellion, 1685, also known as the Pitchfork Rebellion or the West Country Rebellion. This was an attempt to depose James II, who had succeeded his brother Charles II as king in February 1685. Led by a group of dissident Protestants, headed by James Scott, the first Duke of Monmouth. He was the eldest illegitimate son of Charles II. And he opposed James largely to his Catholicism, and he had been exiled in the Dutch Republic. That's a picture of him there, looking very splendid on his nag. On June 11, 1685, he landed at Lyme Regis, where he actually firstly started to have widespread popular support and began a march on London, gathering an army of nonconformists, artisans, farm workers, including a certain Daniel Defoe who turned up. And he started marching on London, hoping, the idea was that he'd actually raise the country and they could all join together to depose James. But it didn't work. And very cleverly at this time, James II, trying to buy time to build up his regular forces, actually put a great piece of political spin. He started making notes and telling people that the country's militia were useless, unreliable, and they couldn't do anything. And actually this got back to Monmouth, who actually increased the speed of advance, trying to get to London faster, thinking, well, the militia are no good, I can just walk through them. It wasn't quite to be. On the 13th of June, Gloucestershire's Lord Lieutenant, Duke of Beaufort, was ordered to take a regiment of foot and one of horse from the Gloucestershire militia, leaving 3 regiments in reserve. He had ordered to go south to join the 700-strong city of Bristol militia to prevent Bristol falling into the hands of the rebels. And the Gloucester militia went down there and they started patrolling the north bank of the Avon, primarily to prevent the Royal Army moving north or crossing into Wales. And we know on the 24th of June, some of Monmouth's army reached Keynsham, and the Gloucestershire force were there as well. So there is a brief battle engagement, was the rebels trying to take the bridge over Keynsham, and the Gloucestershire militia fought back, and they actually, although they did eventually had to retreat, they were actually able to partially destroy the bridge before retreating. And this was quite important because basically by the time the rebels had repaired the bridge and crossed, the Gloucestershire militia stand had allowed more royalist forces to gather, and all this gave Monmouth the impression that there was a much larger royalist force in the area than there actually was. So if Monmouth had ignored this and gone for Bristol, he'd have got there, but he didn't. He thought, I can't do that, I've got to move somewhere else. And eventually he turned east towards Bath, but 6 days later heard more news that there was more royal forces, so began a retreat back into the West Country and a retreat towards Bridgewater, and what was ultimately to turn out to be his doom. By the 5th of July, he was hemmed in around Bridgewater with what was left of his army, and decided the only way he could get away was trying to launch a night attack on the Royal Army, which at the time was at Western Zoyland. And he thought, if I can do a night attack, I can break through, then we can escape, and I can escape, basically. And the result was the Battle of Sedgemoor, the last pitched battle fought on English soil, a total royal victory. Over 2,000 rebels were killed, and some 1,400 were captured. Um, and basically, Monmouth escaped. It was caught a week later and executed at Tower Hill on 5th of July. And it's recorded it took 5 or 7 strokes of the axe to sever his head. I mean, that must have been horrific for him. Thanks were offered around the kingdom after the rebellion's failure. And sadly, we've got a lovely entry, but it's very faint, from Little Barrington, records the thanks given for the victory over Monmouth. And of course, this was the event that triggered the bloody assizes of the Judge Jeffrey. Daniel Defoe was caught. He was actually tried, put in front of Judge Jeffrey, but he escaped execution because he was able to pay a large fine. Presumably he was a downstroke as luck at a writer then, so tried writing things, which what we'll find in a couple of months' time when we do another one of these. I was looking at this entry. This is from Mickleton Parish Registers. I think the Mickleton Barrows might have been milking the Monmouth Rebellion a bit. On the 14th of July and on the 23rd of July, they received a total of 3 shillings 6pence worth of beer, about 21 quid, so a fair amount of beer at the time, for ringing the bells in celebration of the victory. So they rang it twice and they claimed money for it both times. So, sneaky buggers, really. Interesting, the middle entry here, you can see, on July the 21st, it records a shilling paid to the diocesan apparator. An apparator was a church official, and this records payment for a proclamation and a book. Presumably, these were both a book and a proclamation containing the official form of words to celebrate the defeat of the rebels. So this idea of, you said, a set text at the time to defeat the rebels was actually very important, as we've seen earlier as well. Moving on to 1688, we get to the Glorious Revolution. This was a series of events that led to the deposition of James and the installation of his Protestant daughter Mary II and her Dutch husband William of Orange to the throne. The invasion came about due to the need to protect the Protestant religion and the threat of a Catholic heir to the English throne. James's son, James Francis Edward Stuart, we'll come across him again a little bit later, was Catholic, but also protected against the possibility that James would ally with France against the Dutch states, which he was thinking of doing at the time. William landed at Torbay unopposed with 20,000 men and made his way to London quite slowly. He was basically waiting for James's rule to collapse and for him to flee, and that happened within the month. James wasn't that popular anyway, and so faced with this massive sort of army and this big support for William of Orange, he did the sensible thing in the end. As it happened in the Monmouth Rebellion, the county's involvement came with them the county militia and the Duke of Beaufort, who actually was a staunch supporter of James II. And by October 1688, when word reached England that William was going to invade, King James wrote to Beaufort, informed him to gather his forces. And Beaufort subsequently wrote to his officers to raise the foot militia upon this intended invasion, ordering them to gather at Gloucester, Sodbury and Stowe. He ordered that, as well as raising the regular militia, any person of what quality soever be found to endeavour the raising of men without a commission from his majesty, that such persons forthwith be seized and secured with their adherents and accomplices. This is essentially a word saying, if you see any other fit young blokes there not doing anything, grab them in, put them into the militia, conscripting the men against their will to come and fight for the king. Not a popular move. In the event, William's invasion, obviously, as I said earlier, was largely welcomed, as James was unpopular, and although it was mostly bloodless, it wasn't totally peaceable. Interestingly, among William's supporters was the Lord Lovelace, MP for Berkshire, who set out with 70 horse to join the prince when he heard of the landing. But when he reached Cirencester, he found his way barred by some of the Gloucestershire militia, led by the Duke of Beaufort. And this note in the Cirencester Register recounts what happened, basically. Essentially, Lovelace tried to force a passage, but after a short conflict in which a militia captain was killed, Lovelace was overpowered. And though most of his men got clear, he was captured and taken into Gloucester jail by Beaufort. When William heard of this, he sent a note to the Duke of Beaufort threatening to burn Badminton House unless Lovelace was set at liberty. And the Duke of Beaufort, realising by this time which way the wind was blown and that James was doomed, he acquiesced and released Lovelace, who subsequently went to join William. Obviously, Badminton then wasn't burned, and Duke of Beaufort, as always, tried to switch sides, as they do, as the gentry often do. There's a little note added at this, the previous register, about the Glorious Revolution, the fight at Cirencester. It's below that line I showed you earlier. One of those killed was Whitelock Bulstrode, who died at the King's Head, see burial register. And this intrigued me, and I thought, well, dying at a King's pub isn't the worst place to die. And this is the entry in the burial register for Cirencester. You can see it there. Name given here was Bulstrode Whitlock Esquire, so we're not sure which way round it was. The entry records that he died at the King's Head when my son was taken prisoner. So, he must have been somebody sort of fairly important to get a sort of mention in this burial register. But it's quite an interesting sort of sideline. The Jacobites, and I don't know if you, I love the song. 'Twas on a Monday morning, right early in the year, that Charlie came to our town, the young Chevalier. Charlie is my darling, my darling, my darling. Charlie is my darling, the young Chevalier. I won't sing anymore, it's bad for you. Jacobites, well, the repercussions of the Glorious Revolution was to bring many years' unease for the country and the throne. Firstly, there is the 1689 Bill of Rights, which was enacted, which declared that James II essentially abdicated. He wasn't forced out, he did it on his own free will, and therefore that his daughter, Mary II, and her husband, William III, this is William the Orange, were James's successors. It also clarified who would be next to inherit the crown, and was followed quite closely by the 1701 Act of Settlement, which enshrined that the succession could only be to a Protestant, and that at the coronation the sovereign had to swear an oath to keep the Protestant religion. So this left James II's son, James Francis Edward Stuart, aka the Old Pretender, out on a bit of a limb, and he and his son was Charles Edward Stuart, aka the New Pretender or Bonnie Prince Charlie, and their supporters, known as the Jacobites, were to be a threat to the crown for the next half century. And this is another one of my favourite ones here. William and Mary, we know they ruled jointly from 1689 until Mary's death in 1694, after which William ruled alone. In 1702, he died of pneumonia, which was a complication resulting from a broken collarbone following a fall from his horse, White Sorrel. Interestingly, the horse had been confiscated from a Sir John Fenwick, who was a Jacobite who'd conspired against William and been executed in 1697. Because the king had been thrown from the horse after it stumbled into a mole burrow, many Jacobites often made a secret toast to the wee gentleman in the black velvet waistcoat. And again, I love that one. That still happens quite a lot today. So in August 1714, under the terms of the 1701 Act of Settlement, George Louis, the Elector of Hanover and the closest Protestant relative to the newly deceased Queen Anne, became king of the newly created Kingdom of Great Britain as George I. His accession caused a wave of unrest, and in 1715, Jacobites started uprisings in Scotland and Cornwall, aimed at putting James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, on the throne. However, the rebellion misfired, and by the time James landed in Scotland, his forces had already been defeated after defeats at the Battle of Sheriff Moor and the Battle of Preston. The Cornish Jacobites didn't even get as far as a battle. They faded away very, very quickly. James, eventually realising that the game was up, left Scotland on 5th of February 1716 and returned to his life of exile in France. The dream, however, of restoring a Stuart to the throne didn't die with him. And on this note, I have this lovely one. The early 1700s was a widespread time of unrest with lots of rioting. You have the Sacre-Revel riots in 1710, the Coronation riots in 1714, and the Jacobean riots in 1715. So the Crown was quite concerned about this, and this is where we have this lovely Riot Act was introduced. Introduced after the 1715 Jacobean riots, authorised local authorities to declare any group of 12 or more people to be unlawfully assembled and order them to disperse or face punitive action. Failure to do so is a felony offence which carried the death penalty. We could have done with this one a few weeks ago, couldn't we? Local officials had to actually physically read the Riot Act, hence the word. You remember your mum and dad saying, "I'm going to read the Riot Act to you, young man." This is why. They had to read it to activate the act, and after which force could be used to break up any rioters. And this is the Riot Act proclamation. So you'd have to stand in front of the riotous mob and say, "Our sovereign lord the king chargeth and commandeth all persons being assembled immediately to disperse themselves and peacefully to depart to their habitations or to their lawful business upon the pains contained in the act made in in the first year of King George I, preventing tumults and riotous assemblies. God save the king. When she said that, that is it. The rioters were then fair game. It was repealed later on, sadly, in many ways. But we have this lovely little card, and lots of police officers used to have to carry this card in case they were called upon to use the words exactly and try and break up riots. The Jacobite rise in the 15, it did continue, and it did sort of a real massive wave of unrest and suspicion across the country, aimed at primarily at Catholics. There are fewer than 115,000 of these at the time in the country, but also at those suspected of having Jacobite sympathies, who could be English, Scottish, or Irish. And this is a letter dated 22/7/1720, written by William Clutterbuck of Frampton and sent to John Chamberlain of Petty France in Westminster. Very, very scribbly writing, and it's been sort of damaged at some point in its past, but it's all about really the Reverend Rice of Standish, and alleges that he was on the high side of the churchmanship, i.e. he was a Catholic or had Catholic leanings, and it's strongly suspected of him having Jacobite leanings at the time of the rebellion. And you think, well, how did they figure this out? Well, quite simply, the suspicions were voiced because thanks to a reading a prayer sympathetic to the rebellion at the time of it. So that was enough to get him sort of almost accused of being a Jacobite and a supporter of the Jacobites. So because of this, you get these oaths of allegiance. Now, these are actually not new. The first one was actually made to King Edgar in circa 959, so a long time ago. And by 1700 there were two oaths. There was the oath of allegiance, which is the declaration of fidelity to the sovereign, and the oath of supremacy, which is the repudiation of the spiritual or ecclesiastical authority of any foreign prince, person or prelate, i.e. the Pope. But in 1702 a new oath, the oath of abjuration, which repudiated the right and title of descendants of James II to the throne, was introduced. This is squarely aimed at the Jacobites, basically. We're going to give you this one so you can't get any support. And basically, after the rebellion of 1715 had been quashed, nobles, MPs, peers, and lots of clergy were invited to retake the oaths of allegiance and supremacy to His Majesty King George and the abjuration oath pursuant to the statute entitled "An Act for the Further Security of His Majesty's Person and Government, etc." And in the county quarter sessions order books, we've got lots of these, and this is just one. They typically extend over 4 or 5 pages, making sure all the great and the good actually got their names in to make sure they weren't suspected of being sort of Jacobites. So they're quite interesting, and they give lots of names and where the people lived there. At the same time, the 15 also ordered the quarter sessions to draw up lists of papists, known papists in the county, and this is one of them. Again, the quarter session books, known papists listed in the county by hundreds, and again they're quite a few more than you would imagine, to be honest, on those. And again, they go on for a couple of pages. And then we also have sort of the court sessions also charged with making a list of Roman Catholics who own land and estates in the county, presumably so they could be seized if need be. And this is the nice, again, the count of the Roman Catholics who have estates in the county of Gloucestershire, and again, going down by place and telling you who's there and sort of the amount of money they had invested in the land. So after the collapse of the 15, churchmen all over the country preached sermons from the pulpit, giving thanks for the collapse of the rebellion in the standard way that they were wanted to. It's not known who wrote this sermon. This is a lovely sermon, but we know it comes from the Dursley area. It gives thanks for the county's deliverance out of the hands of a barbarous, cruel and bloody traitor, a popish impostor, and also the suppression of this late unnatural rebellion. It's a real vehement anti-Catholic hellfire speech, and there's one epic sentence about 3 pages later describes Bonnie Prince Charles, the young pretender, as a youth taught to govern only with a rod of iron, force of arms, excommunications, inquisitions, fire and faggots, and all the artilleries of the Church of Rome. Isn't that wonderful? You can imagine him up in the pulpit yelling and shouting this speech down to the people who are just probably thinking, what the hell are you on about? But it's a great one. Moving on to the 45, the Jacobite Rising of the 45 was an attempt by Charles Edward Stuart, aka Bonner Prince Charlie, the young pretender, to regain the throne not for himself but for his father, James Francis Edward Stuart. It took place very cleverly by the Jacobites during the War of Austrian Succession, when the bulk of the British army was fighting in Europe. And although it initially met with some success and the Jacobites reached as far down as Derby, it ultimately failed when the Jacobites retreated and then were confronted by government forces at Culloden. It proved to be the last Jacobite rising so far, and although often thought of in terms of England versus Scotland, it wasn't that at all. The reality was Scots and English fought on both sides, so really it's a Jacobites versus the government. It can't be thought in terms of Scotland versus England. This is a letter from the Sharp archive we have here, written by Thomas Sharp, Archdeacon of Northumberland, to his son John Sharp during the invasion of England and the Jacobites marched south in 1745. It reports from Durham that the rebels were thought to be coming towards Durham, but they actually went towards Lancashire and went off towards Kendal. It also mentions General George Wade, who's the commander of the government army. His failure to stop the Jacobites initially led him to being replaced by the Duke of Cumberland, who was to be the subsequent victor at Culloden. And then among the government forces at the Battle of Culloden was a certain James Wolfe. In 1759, he gained posthumous fame after capturing Quebec in the 7 Years' War, partly with the Gloucestershire Regiment. But when the 1745 Jacobite campaign began, Wolfe was an aide-de-camp to Henry Hawley, who was the interim commander of the government forces in Scotland after Wade had been sort of evicted. While on campaign, Wolfe frequently wrote to his uncle, who was William Southerton of Shipton Moyne, and we are so lucky to hold these letters as part of the Southerton Escort family archive. They're wonderful ones. This is just one page, written by Wolfe after Culloden, and it's his eyewitness account of the victory. And during the battle, Wolfe was stationed with the 4th Barrel's Foot, which took part in really fierce hand-to-hand fighting on the government's left wing, and that was the left wing, was the wing that was most heavily engaged at Culloden. We haven't got time to go into Culloden, but if you ever do get the chance to visit the battlefield and the battlefield centre, I thoroughly recommend it. It's absolutely superb. They're really, really good. So the 45 rebellion actually marked the last real threat from internal Catholic revolt, and so began a slow thaw in government restrictions on Catholics, and all their restrictions began to be relaxed. In 1778, so only less than 40 years after the Culloden, the Catholic Relief Act allowed Catholics to join the armed forces without taking the oath of supremacy, repealed laws against Catholic priests, and permitted Catholics to inherit and purchase land. However, the Act required the Catholics should be certified at the quarter sessions, with officiants taking a new oath abjuring any allegiance to the young pretender and denying the Pope's temporal authority. And this is one of the declarations here. It's actually quite hard to read. It's actually quite big. This is probably about 2 foot by 2 foot in size, so it's very difficult to get a decent photo. But you can see there's not many people professing to be Catholics in this, so it's whether they'd had enough and thought, I'll just switch to Protestantism, I don't know. But it's a very interesting document. However, the Jacobites, they've not fully vanished, so they are still about. The current successor to Jacobite cause in the House of Stuart is Franz Herzog von Bayern, born in 1933, commonly known by the courtesy title the Duke of Bavaria, head of the House of Wittelsbach. Were it not for the Act of Settlement of 1701, Franz would be the successor to the English, Scottish and Irish crowns of the Stuart kings. But his spokesman has made it clear this is a purely hypothetical issue and not a claim that he intends to pursue. In his memoirs, he's actually described the claim to the British throne as a charming historical curiosity. Yeah, right. When he dies, succession will pass to this chap, Prinz Luitpold Rutbrig Heinrich Prinz von Bayern. So there is still the Jacobite cause. So if you do want to raise a toast to the gentleman in the wee velvet jacket, these are the guys you've got to toast to. Moving on to Yankee rebels. So the American Revolutionary War rebellion by the 13 colonies ultimately gained independence from Great Britain in the formation, as we know it, of the USA. Discontent with British colonial rule began after the 7 Years' War in 1763. For though American colonies had fought and supported the war, after the war, the British government imposed new taxes to reclaim wartime costs. It also gave control of all the western lands that had been captured to the British officials in Canada. So no wonder the Americans felt a bit hard done by. Britain then sent more troops to America, which were viewed as an occupying army, caused lots of tensions and strengthened American desire for independence. So we brought it on ourselves in a bit of a way. Led to growing political unrest, culminated in the great argument: taxation without representation violated their rights as Englishmen. And war finally broke out in 1775 after the failed British attempt to disarm the Americans led to American victories at the battles of Lexington and Concord. But the war rumbled on. Like George III, British public initially hardened feelings against the rebels and the colonies. We thought, what are they doing? Put them down. And the consensus was for stronger, more coercive measures against the colonists, as it was thought that our leniency in regulation was the culprit for rising tensions. And this is sort of reported in this letter from the nonconformist minister, Dr. Price, to William Adams, master of Pembroke College, Oxford, telling him and questioning the government's warmongering and warning that the next summer would be a very bloody one indeed, and it was. However, many of the working class in England and Britain view the situation through a more positive prism, because they thought, well, if the Americans can, not so much break away, but if they can force the government down here, it might usher in a new era of reform, and it might end our own disenfranchisement, and we might actually get sort of the right to vote, etc., etc. It didn't work. But as we dawn for the period, war extra opportunities for young gentlemen to advance their cause through military prowess or through the lack of it even. And this is a note from Majors Cox and Mayor informed Captain James Blathwaite that he was nominated by Sir William Boothby, Colonel of the 50th Regiment of Foot, to be ready to embark to the Americas with recruits for the British Army station there. So basically he's been promoted, told to get a load of men and basically meet me at Bristol and we'll head off to America. Again, a lovely thing from the Blathwaite archive. The Battle of Fort Washington, fought on November the 16th, 1776. Excuse me. A British victory, one of the worst patriot defeats of the war. And this is a letter from Henry Rooke of the Rooke family, St. Bravils, who were a strong military family. It was written to his brothers Charles and Hayman, and it gives an account of the attack made by the King's troops on the rebels on the fort. And the battle gained the surrender of Fort Washington, which is located at the north end of Manhattan Island, so cleared New York of American rebels, allowing the city to become the British military and political centre for the rest of the war. And this is one of those wars that sort of rumbled and then sort of died out. And you think back, you think, well, if we'd have made a few different decisions, the war would have been totally different. Initially, for example, the Royal Navy had the upper hand and could easily sort of defeat the American fleets as there were, and they ended up being privateers around the coast of the UK largely. But when the French entered the war on the American side in 1778, the tables turned dramatically. The Battle of the Chesapeake was a naval battle fought in September 1781 between an outnumbered and outgunned Royal Navy fleet and a French fleet. And essentially, this letter comes from Captain Francis Reynolds, who was on board HMS Monmouth, to his brother Lord Ducey, describing that they've lost the battle and the French are now in Chesapeake with all the American troops that they can muster. The battle itself, amazingly, was a tactical draw, but it's a strategic defeat for the British Navy because it stopped them from reinforcing or evacuating the besieged forces of General Cornwallis at Yorktown, and ultimately his surrender forced Britain to lose the war and allowed America to gain its independence. One of the problems for the Royal Navy was they were operating so far from home, they couldn't refit the ships, and so they were sort of in very poor condition most of the time. A quick look at the Chartists. For most of existence, Parliament controlled by aristocracy, and less than 10% of men had the vote. In 1832, there was the Great Reform Act, which gave middle-class men the vote, but working-class men were excluded, and many were angry, disappointed, and very resentful. So the Chartists wanted to gain political rights to the working classes, and their demands were publicised through lots of meetings and pamphlets. They were called Chartists because of their People's Charter, which called for the following: the vote for all men over 21, a secret ballot, no property qualification to become an MP, payment for MPs, electoral districts of equal size, annual elections for Parliament. And we're still waiting for some of that, to be honest. The Chartist movement gathered a lot of support, especially in working class areas. Not surprisingly, this included Stride, where woolen and cloth workers were attracted to the cause due to their work conditions and low wages. And the largest Chartist meeting in Gloucestershire was a gathering on Selsley Hill on Tuesday, 21st of May 1839, when around 5,000 people met in support of the Charter. And we know that between 1837 and 1842, there are around 12 similar large Chartist gatherings in and around Stroud. Political elites feared the Chartists because they thought they were a dangerous threat to national stability and they needed to be controlled. However, at the time, there was no police force, so the Gloucestershire Constabulary didn't form until 15th of October 1839. So when Chartist meetings took place, the Justices of the Peace appointed special constables. And this is a list of those who volunteered to attend the Chartist Selsley meeting and were sworn in as mounted special constables by J.P. Thomas Lloyd Baker. And there's a nice long list there, and there's a couple of other lists as well. In the event, all the local meetings passed off peaceably. And this was very lucky because on several occasions, the Army's 12th Lancers were standing by to help if trouble arose. And of course, this would raise the actual threat of another 1819 Peterloo taking place, where sort of the cavalry sort of attacked an innocent innocent crowd in an election rally. Chartism itself didn't directly generate any reform, but after 1848, as the movement faded, some of its demands appeared less threatening to the elites, and some were gradually enacted by other reformers, but not all of them. The National Land Company is sort of an offshoot of the Chartists, was founded in 1845 by the Chartist leader Fergus O'Connor to help working class people meet the landholding requirement to gain a vote in county seats. So basically, have this land, you'd get a vote. If you didn't, you wouldn't get a vote. The idea is for working class people to buy shares in the company, with the money then being used to buy land and build cottages with a small holding. Shareholders would then be chosen by ballot to live and farm in these communities, paying rent, and which would ideally repay all the subscribers with interest. Didn't quite work, sadly. In October, there were a couple of them in Gloucestershire. October 1846, 117 acres land, low bands in Red Marley, in Worcestershire, now in Gloucestershire, were bought, 8,100. June 1847, 268 acres of land, burnt land, were purchased at Sniggs End in Staunton. At Staunton, the balance were held through the autumn of 1847 for the following plots. There were 35 2-acre plots, 12 3-acre, 35 4-acre plots. It's also subsequent claim that the third Chartist petition was taken to Parliament in 1848 on a cart made at Sniggs End and pulled by the estate's horses. And we know that for a time after 1848, Fergal O'Connor lived at Sniggs End. Sadly, one of the problems that the Chartists didn't actually appreciate was the fact that lots of these people came from towns and they were dumped in the middle of the countryside with a few acres. They didn't have a clue what to do. They were not farmers. They didn't know how to farm. This was one of the failings of the actual movement, sadly. But they did build nice houses. These are pictures of some of the Chartist houses that you still, if you drive through Corse today or Staunton, and they're still being used today, still lived in. They're lovely little properties, really pleasant things. Afraid this is a very, very poor map. It got very damaged of the Sniggs End estate. But basically, every black dot you can see there in a black square is a Chartist cottage. So you can see, they were serious about this and they really wanted to try and make it succeed. There were a total of 5 Chartist settlements across the country. A 6th was planned but never carried out. But as we said earlier, the scheme had lots of flaws, and the Parliament was wound up by Act of Parliament in 1851. And most of the estates were sold off, and this is a sales particularly we have for describing that one. We know that after its failure, O'Connor became increasingly erratic, and he basically he was an MP, but he culminated in assault on 3 other MPs and a mental breakdown from which he didn't recover. He died in August 1855, aged 59. Over 40,000 people attended his funeral, so the cause was still there and people still believed in it. First Boer War, very brief conflict prompted by the discontent following the British annexation of the Transvaal in 1877, after which the Boers, who were the descendants of the original Dutch settlers, rose up in revolt, and they were deemed rebels to start with. But they were very clever. Relying on non-standard tactics, the Boers defeated Imperial forces at two major engagements at Laing's Neck and Majuba Hill, and several smaller ones. And the British government realised that the victory would require substantial troop reinforcements and a costly, messy and protracted war. The government actually very quickly signed a peace treaty under unfavourable terms. One of the only times when you could have won, but you decided not to. The Battle of Laing's Neck is important because it was the last occasion where a British regiment carried its regimental colours into battle. And we've got a great Gloucestershire connection. Percy Scrope Marling, what a wonderful name. He was a second lieutenant in the 2nd Battalion, 60th Rifles. He wrote letters. He was involved in lots and lots of campaigns, actually. This is a letter from him to his grandmother, Sir Samuel Marling, hence Marling School, describing the battle at Land's Neck, where the British cavalry and infantry attacks were repelled with heavy losses. We know that of the 480 men made attacked, 84 were killed. It's quite a high number. 113 wounded, and among them are many senior officers who were targeted by Boer sharpshooters. The Boers were great snipers, and they had a lot better idea of how to shoot than the British soldiers did, and they were crack shots, which is what what put us down a lot of the time. Marling survived this war, and he went on to serve in the 1882 Anglo-Egyptian War, the 1886 Mahdi's War, the Second Boer War, and the First World War. In October 1903, he was appointed the Deputy Lieutenant of Gloucestershire and 1923 was made High Sheriff. So he had a really amazing military career. The letters he's written, although some of the writing is a bit poor, they are very, very interesting, although some of the language used is definitely of its time. And that brings us to the end of this one. So again, we're happy to take some questions now. I'll hand back to Gemma in a moment. Our next Heritage Hub event is Plot and Conspiracy. Again, a spotlight on anarchy, rebellions and civil unrest in Gloucestershire, where we'll have the talk on the Diggers and a film, Days of Hope, about the Chartists in Stroud. Please, if you want to come to those talks and the film, please book. They do need to be booked for numbers. As usual, we've got the display of documents, free refreshments, and the Gloucestershire Family History Society will be on hand to find your rebel roots. And our last little plug is for next Secrets Revealed talk, 25th September, No More Twist, to look at some of the children's classics that have got links to the county. So make sure you've got your parrot, your bottle of potion, a goatskin hat, Quidditch broom, and some twist to join us on a trip to the archives and Neverland. And with that, Gemma, over to you.
Thank you so much, John. That was really fascinating. So thank you very much for that. I'm just having a quick check in chat just to see if there are any last questions. I don't think there are. Just bear with me while I just scan up.
People are fed up with your voice, I would think.
I don't think so, John. No, we haven't got any questions. So thank you very much indeed to everybody who's joined us today. Thank you to John for doing such wonderful talk. Please do join us for the next one and also for the next Saturday event. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, folks. Cheerio.